Hello, buddies. The Lunar Module of the Apollo 11 mission touched down on the Moon on July 20, 1969. In it were astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. Following the landing, Neil Armstrong attempted to unlock the door and descend to the Moon. Due to the intense pressure, it wasn't simple to open this door, but he eventually succeeded. Then, in his bulky spacesuit, he attempted to descend to the Moon. The escape was cramped. As a result, he struck the top by accident and a piece of the lunar module was lost. Due to the absence of air, none of them was conscious of this. The sound did not spread. There was silence around them. However, this damaged component was very important. It was the arming switch for the Ascent engine. They couldn't launch their lunar module once more or get back to Earth without this switch. Neil Armstrong exited the spacecraft unaware of this and stepped onto the Moon's surface. He accomplished the first ever lunar landing. One tiny move for human beings, a massive move for mankind. But did it happen? Many people still contest that humans have visited the Moon more than 50 years later. People create their own hypotheses to contend that America staged the entire Apollo 11 mission as a joke. They lied to the public and filmed the sequences on Earth. Without air, how else do you account for the flags fluttering? What is the case? Let's watch today's video and attempt to understand this tale. Everything is idling. We select to go to the space in a decade and do additional things not when they are simple, but rather they are tough. The Eagle has touched down at Tranquility Base. One tiny step forward for man, one enormous stride for humanity. You'll be shocked to learn, friends, that a war was the real motivation behind the planning of the Apollo 11 mission, the Cold War, between the United States and the Soviet Union. The space race involved both nations. The first artificial satellite was launched by the Soviet Union in 1957, making it the first nation to do so. The first artificial object to enter Earth's orbit bore the moniker Sputnik. The Soviet Union's advancement astounded the American administration. American satellites were also launched a few months later, in 1958. But America experienced another shock 3 years later, in 1961. The first person to travel to space was a Soviet cosmonaut named Yuri Gagarin. Once more, the Soviets defeated the Americans. John F. Kennedy, who was the country's president at the time, sent a letter to the vice president on April 20, 1961, 1 week later. He inquired as to how they may defeat the Soviet Union from the vice president, by putting a laboratory in space or by a trip around the Moon. Are we devoted to executing the current programs 24 hours a day? Why then, not? Are we making the maximum effort? Inquiring as to whether there was another space program that might be quickly implemented, yield dramatic results, and give them a lead in the race. It took him a few days to realize that sending people to the Moon would be the next significant step, but he eventually found the solution. He made the world a pledge to take people to the Moon by the end of the decade on May 25, 1961, in his well-known speech. He also pledged to return mankind to Earth in a secure manner. Before this decade is out, of landing a man on the Moon and returning him safely to the Earth. This announcement shocked a lot of people. Friends, try to picture the year 1961. There were no smartphones, no internet, and not even GPS. He offered to transport people to the Moon at a period when computers were so antiquated and slow. He gave the space program an additional $7.9 billion over the following 5 years to compensate for this. The achievement of this single objective occupied the entire space agency. The tests started just a few months later. The rockets that will be utilized to exit the Earth were first tested. The command module's heat shields were then put to the test. How much heat resistance would they have? Then the service module's propulsion system. There were numerous unmanned tests conducted between 1963 and 1967. No people were aboard the rockets during the tests. Manned testing was set to begin in February 1967. Astronauts will launch into orbit for the purpose of testing. The Apollo 1 mission was this. However, on January 27, 1967, the cabin caught fire during testing on Earth, killing the 3 men who were getting ready to go into space. After this traumatic incident, NASA maintained its bravery. Instead, it carried out more experimentation. All the manned missions for the Apollo programs, Apollo 4, Apollo 5, and Apollo 6, were unmanned. With the launch of the Apollo 7 mission in October 1968, another attempt to transport people into space was made. This worked out well. Apollo 8 mission, which took 3 men close to the moon, was launched just 2 months later, in December 1968. The launch of the Apollo 9 mission occurred in March 1969, 3 months later. The lunar module was put to the test in the area of the spacecraft intended to touch down on the moon. Additionally, 2 months later, in May 1969, was the mission of Apollo 10. Except for landing on the moon, 3 astronauts had to perform nearly all of the tasks that would have been performed during the Apollo 11 mission as preparation. Take note of how quickly NASA launched the missions one after the other. A new venture to test the next step will be launched in the following 2 to 3 months. Testing, spacecraft, rockets, and missions to the moon led to the launch of the Apollo 11 mission on July 16, 1969. Following all these tests, there are no idle engines. We are ready for takeoff. It is 32 minutes after the hour. The launch of Apollo 11. This flight featured 3 astronauts. Commander Neil Armstrong, age 38. I'll explain the extremely intriguing explanation behind this later in this video. There were 3 key components to the spacecraft for the Apollo 11 mission, specifically the Lunar Module, Service Module, and Command Module. The first 2 are referred to as CSM, Service and Command Module. The Lunar Module was intended to be detached and made to touch down on the moon. And to enable the astronauts to return to Earth, the Lunar Module would need to be relaunched and linked to the CSM. This spacecraft was to be launched using a Saturn V5 rocket, 1 million gallons, each of liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, and kerosene were loaded onto the rocket before the launch. This rocket weighed 3 million kg. The spaceship was able to enter Earth's orbit thanks to it. The travel time to the orbit was less than 10 minutes. The mission control, which was of course situated on Earth, then gave them the go-ahead to start trans-lunar injection after they had completed around 1.5 revolutions around the planet. Directing the spaceship away from Earth's orbit and toward the orbit of the moon. The Saturn V5 rocket was utilized to depart Earth's orbit. The rocket's 3rd stage was this one. Within 5 hours after the debut, these things happened, but it took several days to get to the moon. After traveling over 400,000 kilometers, astronauts waited aboard the spaceship while eating, sleeping, and taking pictures of their surroundings on July 19, 1969. The lunar orbit was attained by the Apollo 11 mission. It was going to be divided into 2 parts here. The Lunar Module and the Command and Service Module parted. The Command Module, also known as Columbia, was where Michael Collins was located. Additionally, the Eagle was given to the Lunar Module. It included Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. The problem is that the Command and Service Module's job was to continue orbiting the moon. The only thing that would land on the moon is the Lunar Module. As a result, Michael Collins was denied the opportunity to walk on the moon, leaving only Armstrong and Aldrin. Maybe that's why so few people are familiar with Michael Collins. Despite being a member of the Apollo mission, he did not walk on the moon. Michael Collins' contribution to this mission was, however, arguably the most crucial, because the Lunar Module was intended to be reattached to the CSM. Armstrong and Aldrin would not have been able to make a safe return without Michael Collins. The Lunar Module was set to land on the moon at around 8 p.m. Alarms went off at exactly 8:10 p.m. The 12:01 and 12:02 alarms, 12:01, 12:01, rudder 12:01 alarm. Armstrong and Aldrin were unaware of the significance of this signal. They inquired as to the best course of action from mission control. They are instructed to ignore it and keep moving by mission. Control, we're go. Same type, we're go. They later discovered that 12:02 was a warning. The Apollo's guiding computer's processing system was overworked. Fortunately, the computer was built so that even when it was overloaded, the vital programs that were required for the operation would still run. The automatic landing program was installed on the computer. The Lunar Module would then automatically touch down on the moon's surface. But Neil Armstrong took charge at a height of 150 meters. He observed that the Lunar Module was due to land in an area with numerous large stones. The landing location was then altered. For the actual landing, they chose a location 4 miles away from the original landing point. Buzz Aldrin looked at the fuel gauge at 8:16 p.m. 100 feet, 3-to-1/2 down, 9 forward, 5%. Okay, the remaining fuel was only 5%. When Mission Control realized there was not much fuel left, they started the countdown. The timer is counting down till they must decide whether to land or terminate the mission. We are currently in a critical fuel state. The 60-second call is made for this reason. The 30-second call follows. Neil Armstrong relayed a radio transmission to Earth at the very last second, literally with just 30 seconds left in this countdown. Roger, tranquility. Successful landing for the Eagle. After donning his spacesuit, Neil Armstrong unlocked the door and walked out onto the moon. On television, 650 million people watched this event. The entire globe watched him speak on television. He was followed on the moon's surface by Buzz Aldrin, and for the subsequent 2.5 hours, they snapped pictures, put up various scientific instruments, collected samples of the moon's dust and rocks, and more. Even though the Cold War played a significant role in this moon landing, it was already planned and a tremendous accomplishment. Thus, it is apparent that they were carrying scientific equipment. This mission included several scientific goals as well. To send signals to Earth, they installed a television camera on the moon. They brought a tool to evaluate the solar wind's impact on the moon. They set up a gadget to send laser beams to Earth so that the precise distance between the Earth and moon could be calculated using the laser beams. A passive seismometer was also present to gauge the moon's tremors. Naturally, they are known as moonquakes. They brought back 23 kilograms of lunar rock and dust. They also left an American flag behind. Furthermore, there was a plate that read, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot on the moon." July 1969, AD. For 21 hours, the Lunar Module was required to stay on the moon. It then had to take off again to attach to the CSM, but they needed propulsion to ascend, and an engine was necessary for that. Armstrong and Aldrin were both unaware that the switch that started the engine had become detached as they exited. This was something I said at the start of the video. What had transpired was realized when they returned to the Lunar Module. They alerted Mission Control to the damage and searched for a method to deal with the issue. They came up with a creative fix for the issue. So, just what is a switch? Switches essentially complete electrical circuits. Buzz Aldrin came to understand that if the circuit breaks, they search for something that can be used to complete the circuit once more. He discovered his ballpoint pen when he cast a glance at it. He finished the circuit and ignited the engine with the help of the ballpoint pen. As the three astronauts point the spaceship towards Earth, the Lunar Module was finally reattached to the CSM. The command module and the service as a whole module were intended to be separated during the landing on Earth, and the service module was intended to be destroyed by the Earth's atmosphere. However, there was a risk that if the service module suffered severe damage, pieces of it could hit the command module as they were floating around, destroying the astronauts aboard. NASA fitted thrusters in the service module to prevent this, to transport it far away from the command module to prevent collisions. But when the astronauts arrived back on Earth, they discovered that the service module's engines weren't functioning. The only thing the three astronauts could do was sit in the command module and observe the service module disintegrate all around them. All around them, the wreckage was drifting. The fact that the fragmented parts missed the command module is a miracle. The command module is also kept secure. The likelihood that the astronauts would perish during this mission was so great that U.S. President Nixon had a backup speech prepared if they did perish. Can you think of another speech to give? He had penned the following in it: "Fate has dictated, the men who travel to the moon to explore in peace shall stay on the moon to rest in peace." Edwin Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, two courageous men, are aware that there is no chance of them recovering. The highest ideal of humanity is what these two men are giving their lives to achieve: the pursuit of knowledge and insight. Fortunately, though, this wasn't necessary. In a secure descent, the command module entered the Earth's atmosphere. Once the parachutes were opened, it made an ocean landing. There was no danger to any of the three astronauts. Rescue ships from the ocean then brought these astronauts to safety. The fact that they made it back alive was absolutely a miracle. The mission did not go quite as planned. They encountered difficulties practically at every turn. They were able to overcome the issues and make it come back alive. It's noteworthy to recall that the 3 astronauts had to spend 2 weeks in quarantine after their return. They were prohibited from interacting with other people due to the possibility that they may carry infections, viruses, or germs that they may have encountered on the moon and which may potentially cause havoc on Earth. Nobody was certain, but once more, it's a relief that nothing of the sort occurred. The lunar landing by Apollo 11 made headlines across the globe. NASA helped to fulfill U.S. President Kennedy's vow to have astronauts land on the moon before the end of the decade. In 1969, the general public had little grounds to doubt humanity's historic landing on the moon. The accomplishment was a celebration of technological dominance after all. The space race had finally been won by America. Isn't it odd that America had reached the moon a year earlier, in 1969, during the decade that was due to end in 1970? It can't be true that America organized a false moon landing operation to gain an advantage during the Cold War, can it? That after their real moon landing mission failed, they prepared this fictitious mission as a fallback for public display. Friends, this is only one of many conspiracy theories centered on the moon landing that exist. However, my friends, the truth is that these conspiracies have already been disproven numerous times. The Soviets would never have acknowledged it if this were an American hoax intended to trick the world. However, this lunar landing was repeatedly cited as truth in the third edition of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, which was produced between 1970 and 1979. Even Soviet publications claimed that the Apollo landing was the third significant historical occurrence of the space age. The first was the launch of Sputnik in 1957, followed by Yuri Gagarin's flight in 1961, and the moon landing in 1969. In fact, the Soviet Union had admitted as much. What about the flag, though? Why was the flag, which was placed on the moon, flapping? The moon is devoid of air. Friends, there is an easy explanation for that. It was a specially made flag that Armstrong and Aldrin brought with them to the moon. The typical flag has a single long vertical rod. However, this also included a horizontal rod. So that the flag would constantly be spread out, it should be placed directly at the top. It's being moved by the astronauts as they are holding it. The aluminum rods in the flag were serving as springs, which is why this happened. As a result, the flag would briefly move before becoming still. According to the third most prevalent theory, in the images shot by Armstrong and Aldrin, no stars can be seen. This has a pretty straightforward solution. In the daytime, the moon landed, when the moon was being illuminated by the sun. Additionally, the astronauts' white spacesuits were highly reflected. Back then, the cameras lacked the resolution to see through reflections. Even today, if you use the camera on any phone to snap a picture at night and the flash is on, you won't be able to see the stars in the background. Another explanation relates to the shadows and the irregularities in their angles. Some claim that because this was like a Hollywood movie, there wasn't just one source of light. Because of this, the shadows are dispersed all over the place. However, there were other sources of light besides the sun. Because of how much light it was reflecting, the moon's surface was also acting as a supplementary source of illumination. This is why the shadows were so strange and the light dispersed in all directions. Neil Armstrong's photograph of Buzz Aldrin raises still another doubt. It displays Armstrong's reflection, but you can also make out a camera in his palm. How is this even possible? It's because the camera wasn't in his hand. Rather, it was attached to his outfit. And from there, he had power over it. Then again, who was the photographer that captured Neil Armstrong leaving the Lunar Module? Again, a straightforward response. The Lunar Module was equipped with numerous cameras. Beyond these absurd beliefs, however, if we talk about criticism that exists, friends, not everyone was cheering the moon landing and praising NASA's efforts. Instead, many people harshly criticized NASA and the American government in the wake of the lunar landing. Even before the moon landing, it was receiving criticism. The New York Times stated in a story from January 1962 that the money being spent to fly to the moon could have been used to create at least 120 colleges the size of Harvard. They debated whether spending so much money on a trip to the moon would be better spent than creating an institution the size of Harvard in each U.S. state. There must have been better ways to use that money. Basically, the main critique was that the nation had a great deal of issues, including issues with education and wealth inequality. At the time, America was also dealing with the effects of the Vietnam War. Why then did this spend so much money in vain? However, the moon landing brought a lot of unintended advantages that no one had even considered. Improvements in computer chips, for instance. 3 years have passed since the creation of microchips in 1962. In the early 1960s, IBM also made the decision not to incorporate these processors in their computers. A packed integrated circuit is included. There is a silicon chip inside this package that performs the intended function by acting as the electrical equivalent of several transistors, resistors, and diodes when coupled together. But after receiving so many orders from NASA to purchase integrated circuits, IBM began to develop one, and because of the high demand, its price dropped by more than 90% over the course of the following 5 years. NASA conducted a test to see if computers could be trusted to protect people's lives. We can undoubtedly rely on these computer chips for our daily lives if astronauts could travel to and from the moon with them. In the years following this moon landing, technology advanced rapidly. However, in December 1972, just 3 years after the Apollo 11 mission, Apollo 17 was the last moon mission to occur. Friends, it has been about 50 years since that time. In these 50 years, nobody else visited the moon. This is possibly the clearest illustration of how pricey the Apollo program was. It has been laboriously developed by over 400,000 engineers, scientists, and technicians, and the overall expense at the time was $24 billion. The price is more than $100 billion in today's money. At first, only journalists voiced their criticism. The typical person's interest in NASA and the moon, however, had faded by 1972. Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assemble in the nation's capital for a mass protest while the war went on and the difficulties of the populace grew. They thought it was a waste of money to fund the space program. Politicians had to take the opinions of the public into account and reduce funding for space initiatives, even if NASA had plans for flights up to Apollo 20. Donald Trump, a former president, pledged in December 2017 to enhance funding to enable human return to the moon by 2024, returning American astronauts to the moon for the first time since 1972 for long-term exploration and use this time. Later, he modified his position and advocated for NASA to concentrate on Mars rather than the moon. However, 50 years later, NASA has announced new ambitions to fly astronauts to the moon. Their Fresh Artemis initiative. The first woman would be sent to the moon by NASA in 2025 to 2026, after which they would start testing with unmanned rockets. The first person of color will then be sent to the moon after that. There is one thing that is certain, we'll see people on the moon again before the decade is over. You should subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed this video. Let's talk in the next video. I sincerely appreciate it.